Alrighty, let's go ahead and begin. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar, which is titled SOBC 101, the Science of Behavior Change for Psychological Scientists. My name is Andy DeSoto, and I'm the Director of Government Relations at APS. And if you are familiar with the Association for Psychological Science, we're an international organization of 30,000 individuals who are dedicated to advancing psychology across disciplinary and geographic borders. I'm very excited today to introduce a very special presentation from two speakers who represent the NIH-funded Science of Behavior Change, or SOBC initiative, which seeks to apply an experimental medicine approach to understanding and modifying health-related behaviors. Now, in my opinion, SOBC is one of the most exciting things happening in the psychological science of health and illness right now. I can't tell you the number of people that I've spoken to, NIH representatives or others who have said, you've got to check out what SOBC is up to. And for that reason, I'm really excited to introduce our two speakers who will give a 101 style introduction of SOBC for you APS members and psychological scientists. Our speakers today are Michael Otto, who is an APS fellow and professor of psychological and brain sciences at Boston University, and APS member Jeffrey Burke, who is instructor in medical sciences at Columbia University Irving Medical Center. Before we get started, just a few quick logistical details. This webinar will be 60 minutes long. So you know, participants' cameras and microphones will be off during this session. And there will be an opportunity for questions and answers at the conclusion of the speaker's discussion and presentation. Please, you can use the question and answer box. It's at the bottom of your screen to submit questions. This event's going to be recorded, so we'll follow up with the recording of the video, and a write-up of today's presentation will also be made available in case you're interested in reading that later. So with that, let me hand it over to Michael to begin the presentation. Take it away, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andy. Thanks a lot, and thanks everybody for coming. As you have two speakers, and you'll get me in the very beginning, get me at the very end, and then Jeff Burke you'll have for a crucial middle part of today's presentation. All right, before I launch, let me get to a disclosure just to make things clear. Just our next slide. I do receive some funding from industry, in this case from Big Health, which makes apps for offering cognitive behavior therapy interventions, primarily marketed to employees of very large companies. And of course, I have royalties from a number of presses. That is relevant in part because I'm going to talk about manualized treatment. And so when I'm a little critical of manualized treatment here in about, well, near the end, after about 40 slides, you can know that I'm also criticizing myself here. All right, my disclosure's out of the way. Let's get to the challenge. The challenge is, oh my gosh, United States of America, what a great place. What a leading country, except not in what we're doing with our health. And this little graphic gives a good view of this, of developed countries. So we have a swatch of developed countries. And think of the picture this way. The further you go around in this circle, the more you're spending per capita on health. The words to go with this graphic, right? Chronic diseases, as most of you know, accounts for 7 out of 10 of deaths in the United States. Treatment for these diseases, big part of the healthcare chunk, 85%. For us today, many of these chronic diseases are preventable, but the bad news to frame our talk here is that we spend so much per capita without getting really good outcomes. So poorest healthcare outcomes among high-income nations is not how I want the United States represented in the future. Let's go to the next slide. So part of what we're going to be talking about is health behaviors. You see some of the usual suspects here: exercise, eating, substance use. But let's put some numbers to these with the next slide here. All right. When we look at risk factors for mortality and risk factors for disability adjusted life years, which is the way in which your quality of life is depressed, an accounting of that by chronic diseases, and we look at risk factors for the burden of diseases here in the US, this is what you get. We've boxed in red some of these, and look at there up top, we have dietary risks. Right under that, we have the consequences of tobacco use. Not too far down there, we get alcohol and drug use. And not too far down there, we get low physical activity. And let me just remind you that it's sort of even worse in that you all know that many of the people who have one of these risk factors have additional risk factors. You know, this is a very common clumping of overweight, using some of these substances, as in smoking or drinking, and having low physical activity. So aside from the individual contributions, we know that some of our patients are affected by the combination of a number of these. Very concerning. Let's keep going. So just from that slide, but from lots of data as well, we know that behavior is among the most important factors helping determine whether people, our patients, our friends, us will live a long and healthy life. But few interventions are doing really well to lead to long-lasting behavior change, right? Short-acting behavior change, we've got some candidates, but long-lasting behavior change that can be disseminated widely and work with lots of people, we've been missing on that front. And National Institute of Health is aware we've been missing on that front. So NIH decided to try to put some more effort where the action is, which is on behavior. What does effort mean for the NIH? What are the tools that NIH has for effort? Well, they have the tools of directing us toward the type of grants that they want to, the type of research that they want to see come in, the type of grants they'll offer, but also money makes a difference. So the idea was to put more resources into understanding the behavioral, social research targeting basic mechanisms, the why of behavior change. Why does this intervention work to lead to this behavior change relevant primarily, and come back to the meaning of this, health-related behaviors. Now let me pause there to sort of antedate some of the examples coming up. Probably in my disclosures, I should have said I'm kind of an odd academic, right? Most academics sort of find their research right answer, the disorder they love, and they really drill down to understand lots about that. That's not how I've done my career. Those of you that know me know I'm kind of an, anxiety, depression, bipolar, substance abuse, health behavior guy. Like I get around. And in fact, my parents, I think, when I was born, they were thinking about making my middle name transdiagnostic, but they thought William just kind of flowed better. So I didn't get that. But I am transdiagnostic, and that makes a difference because some of it's really behavioral medicine-y, and some of it is more traditional clinical psychology hat in mental health. And that's a nice backdrop to talk about some of these things. So just to tell you where, we've been talking in kind of this behavioral medicine realm, but as I go forward, you're going to see examples across different realms. All right, let's go to the next slide. So to deal with this, SOBC is formed, and it's a common fund, which means that the issues are facing lots of different institutes. And so common fund is when different institutes all put in money to say, let's get some advances here because it makes a difference for all our individual specialty areas. So SOBC by its nature, richly transdiagnostic, and its goal is to accelerate the investigation of common mechanisms of behavior change to help us understand a broad range of health-related behaviors. But health-related includes mental health. All right, let's go to the next one. So this is just a slide to frame that I'm not just talking about risk behaviors like smoking, drinking, eating too much, not exercising. There's lots of other areas where the core action of health is limited or is sort of moderated by how good people are with certain behaviors, like going for screening or not, or their medical decision making, or treatment adherence. So let me get to some of these examples as well. Medication non-adherence. I like this in my, are these widget people? I can't quite remember their names, but I like that the average score given is a 5, as in 50%, because you look at the literature, not hard to see half as the average outcome here. Let's go to the next slide. First slide, I'm doing medication adherence, just to have a nice mental health example here. And as you see, as you get out to 12 weeks, half the people taking antidepressants have stopped taking the antidepressants. And let's just pause and think about this in the context of what you know is recommended for antidepressant treatment, like minimum treatment, 6 months, commonly recommended going out a year, and yet at 12 weeks, half the sample out. And the bad news is if I pull up another disorder, namely bipolar disorder, it's again 50%, except that 50% is closer to 8 weeks out than 12 weeks out. So we have this, if we have a treatment for a disorder, in this case, pharmacologic treatment that still runs through behavior as a limiting factor. Let's go to the next slide. Let's go to another more behavioral medicine example, HIV medication adherence. And as I put in the slide, it's a no fooling, take your medication type of disorder, right? This is a disorder whose outcome, HIV was, at the top of our sense of the dreaded disease at one point. And the problem with that is if your adherence isn't really high, you may have maybe creating the conditions for the medication no longer to work, for treatment resistance. And so even though those of you that are in the area of adherence, usually 80% is a great number for medication adherence, it is not good enough for this disorder. So we have this case here with HIV and other disorders that we get to have this great push for drug development that still relies on adherence. And just to give one example, Life Steps was kind of the first validated treatment to aid HIV medication adherence to try to make better use of the drug development to help save people's lives. Next slide. All right, now, a couple examples about pharmacologic treatment, but what about behavioral limitations on more behavioral treatments? We have HIV I mentioned. Next up is exercise. And that's also going through all sorts of innovation. In fact, you go to your grocery store back remember when you used to be able to walk into the grocery store? You'd see covers like these on the magazines. And what they're all, at some point, advertising is really a technological advance, not quite the right word, but there's been this advance in how to exercise better and more briefly with intervals being the all out, rest, all out, rest, all out, which is really good. I say technological because if you want to aid fat burning, if you want to calorie use and it's a great way of rapidly developing more muscle. Like if you're going to compete at something and you want to get there fast, intervals are terrific. And they're aversive. They are so aversive. And aversiveness, let's go back one, aversiveness in exercise is what makes a difference for adherence. In fact, every time I try intervals, now I like exercising, every time I do intervals, I go through Kubler-Ross's stages of dying. And I never quite get to acceptance because you take a break and then you got to do it again. So it's this really aversive way of working out. So an advance that is perfect if you're a muscle on a stick, not that much of advance if you're new to exercise and we actually want to get adherence. All right, let's keep going. Let's do something more recent. Could there be any more recent development than watching this tremendous push to get a vaccine for COVID? We have pushed to get a vaccine for COVID. And yet we have all sorts of concerns about taking the vaccine, the anti-vaxxers. So just to say, one response from SOBC was to do presentations and look at the science and the role for people like us in the rollout and trying to aid adherence to this tremendous advance. All right, next slide. So to sum up a lot of what I'm trying to say here, I'm sort of co-opting this old immigration cartoon. Instead of Europe in the background, what's in the background is all sorts of innovations in healthcare, both behavioral, pharmacologic, anything of trying to create new ways of fighting disease. But those are still, my point is, going through often this funnel of some sort of behavior change to get those into the patient, to get the patient to do those things. So if we really want a healthy America, the onus is on us, those people listening to this talk, to really up our game on behavior change and having reliable behavior change mechanisms that are known and that we can rely on. That's our topic coming up. Let's go to the next slide. And the next slide says a new way forward. And to help you have that new way forward, we have our new speaker. Jeff Burke will take it from here for a while.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Michael. Hope everybody can hear and see me. And thank you, Andy DeSoto, and everyone at APS for organizing this really great webinar. It's an honor to be able to speak to you all. And thanks to the attendees for coming today. So following up on Dr. Otto's call to action there and outlining the NIH efforts being put forth into SOBC, I want to sort of explain a little bit about what SOBC has been doing, is currently doing, and the methodology. So under that overall umbrella of the SOBC mission that Dr. Otto was laying out for you, there are some specific goals that they're aiming to hit. And so one of these being uniting basic and applied researchers. So a key motivator for SOBC over the last decade or more has been the idea that scientists are often working in silos. So it's not just that they're in their own labs or their own departments or universities or healthcare centers, but they're actually working in different content areas, and they're also working at different levels of science. So there's the experimental scientists working at basic science, for example, and then the applied researchers who are doing intervention work and trying to get out behavior change initiatives and apply them and scale them up. And so getting communication and ultimately collaboration between those basic and applied researchers is really key to making progress here. So the second goal is focusing on mechanisms of change. In some ways, that should be the first goal because it's really the core of SOBC. I'll be talking about the mechanistic focus and how that, the steps for that in a moment. Third goal being to develop and apply a common scientific method shared across all researchers working on behavior change science. And a fourth, ultimately, being to optimize interventions to promote the effectiveness so that these interventions that are understood at a basic level actually can be then implemented into the real world to change behavior and address some of those health problems that were presented earlier here. So typically, intervention research proceeds according to a sort of reasonable series of steps shown here. So some kind of health behavior is identified as a problem. And as Dr. Otto was stating, medication non-adherence is one of the big problems that remains for decades. And it's one of the health behaviors that really motivated this initiative in the first place. And it really remains relevant over time. So in cardiac patients, for instance, of all different types, acute coronary syndrome and others, taking their daily aspirin is about 1 in 2 patients are adherent at an 80% level according to this, depending on the study, but it's a high degree of non-adherence. And a variety of interventions have been proposed and tested. Many of these are multifaceted, really expensive, large-scale studies that have components, sort of educational components, sometimes reminders, all kinds of really well-guided and reasoned components. And then you hope to see a change in behavior, sometimes do and sometimes don't. But the problem with this general approach, and maybe this is no surprise based on what we've set up here so far, is that it leaves you with a black box. You don't know if the change in behavior occurs, why it occurred, and if it fails to occur, what was the ingredient that was missing in the intervention? That remains unknown. And so SOBC aims to provide a common method to open up this black box and study the mechanisms to better understand behavior change. So it's really, I believe, reasonable assertion, I hope you'll agree, and a reasonable mission. And it just requires a systematic series of steps to be laid out for researchers to then follow. So this is not rocket science ultimately, but it is behavior change science. So we have to have some kind of system to follow here. So very reasonably, we use the experimental medicine approach. So this has been going since at least 1856, applied to a different series of problems. And here it's simply being adapted and adopted in the SOBC framework. So it consists essentially of 4 phases in this context. So the first phase is to identify a mechanism that is potentially underlying behavior change. This can be done either based on theory. So you might have social cognitive theory or some other theory of behavior change that you then apply, and maybe there's a particular mechanism such as self-efficacy that's identified in the theory that you believe to be relevant to the behavior of interest. Let's say it's physical activity, taking daily steps. Or alternatively could be identified in empirical literature that you see repeatedly correlational evidence that a particular potential mechanism is linked to particular behavior change. So that's in some ways the easiest step, but important to mark in a deliberate way. And the second phase is then to measure that putative mechanism. That also may seem obvious. All of this in some ways is obvious, but this is a really important step to sort of drill down on, think about. We want to make sure that we are measuring the mechanism of interest and not something off to the side or adjacent or a little bit different. And so you want to make sure that it's a valid mechanism and that it has good convergent and discriminant validity, that you're measuring the target of interest, and also that it's a reliable measure. So for example, if it's a self-report scale, you want to make sure the items of that scale hang together well and have good internal consistent reliability. And then, of course, critically, you want to demonstrate empirically that you can influence the mechanism. So ideally, this is done in a randomized controlled trial with proper controls, and you see that the mechanism actually changes as a result of your chosen intervention. All of these things can happen in a single study, but don't necessarily need to. And then the fourth phase is to actually then demonstrate that the change in the mechanism is actually associated with the desired change in the behavior. So hopefully all of that sounds very sensible and reasonable to you. As you're hearing it, you may be picturing sort of a statistical model like this, mediation model, and that would be entirely appropriate. So SOBC does not require, but certainly endorses and encourages use of mediation testing as you go through the SOBC stages, particularly the later stages of the SOBC method, to test that the association between your intervention and the behavior of interest is in fact mediated through an indirect path passing through the mechanism of interest when you actually measure the mechanism with a valid and reliable measure. And then you may want to include covariates depending on the nature of the behavior or the research test that you're exploring in particular. So at this point, being a group of psychological scientists, you may be asking yourselves, but aren't we all already doing this? And it's a very reasonable question, which is why it's the top of this slide here. But the answer, frankly, seems to be no. Many of us are doing this, but to move behavior change science forward, it needs to happen more consistently than it already is. And just to take, again, the example of medication adherence, this really key health behavior that continues to be non-optimal despite decades of research on this and efforts to change it. So this systematic review from 2018 was looking at NIH-funded intervention trials that aim to improve that particular health behavior, to review the extent to which mechanisms were included in those trials. And it was found that actually only 11% of these trials tested a hypothesized mechanism. And so authors concluded that, similar to previous findings, very few studies of behavior change interventions seem to actually test the mechanism by which the intervention is hypothesized to improve health behaviors. And it's important, that word hypothesized is important to make a side note here, that often, and this is very often the case, that intervention papers will, in their introduction and their discussion and conclusion and threaded throughout the paper, there will be theory and there will be specified mechanisms, but they will not necessarily be measured mechanisms. And so it's really just, if I haven't drilled home the point enough, that the key is to measure that mechanism and study using this method. Okay, so moving on to how the SOBC method is being implemented. So we're just coming out of a 5-year phase of SOBC that just ended in 2020 and moving into this new phase in 2021. And I'm just going to describe a little bit of the work that has been done and that's now launching in the new phase. So in the prior phase, SOBC consisted of a originally rather small, but what became a medium-sized research network of scientists all over the US. So there was a group of scientists with UH3 grants that were exploring assay development validation for these pre-specified targets. And each of these groups registered their science in the open science framework. Another key of SOBC is open, transparent science. At that time, the Resource and Coordinating Center was based entirely at Columbia University Medical Center. There was also this expansion to include R21 projects to look at exploratory sort of pilot research into new mechanisms of behavior change, as well as revisions to existing grants to pull in the SOBC method. So it's a lot of diverse research from scientists exploring a whole variety of health behaviors, different kinds of interventions, and different mechanisms. And so I want to lay out 3 sort of buckets of different mechanisms that we have examined so far in SOBC. And they divide up pretty nicely. You'll notice if you look at these that they're not entirely mutually exclusive, but they're pretty nice way to group things and think about them. So self-regulation is the largest one so far in terms of what's been examined in the SOBC network. And this has to do with any cognitive, affective, or self-referential processes that might be used to guide health behavior in some way. And of course, there's everything relating to stress, stress reactivity, and stress resilience. Obviously very relevant to behavior, as we all know, from the stress of 2020 and changed behavior in 2020. And then finally, interpersonal and social processes. So behavior change does not occur just for individuals. People are influenced by their family networks and larger communities. And I'm sure all the social scientists on the webinar here really know the importance of these interpersonal factors. And I'll just say that this has been relatively unexplored, as you'll see in a subsequent slide here, so far in SOBC network studies. So we're hoping to expand that and encourage you all to come in and add to these mechanisms. So rather than going through the list of all the names of the UH3 projects and the R21s and all of that, and the interventions and all the variety of health behaviors, I thought it might be helpful to just think about the variety of mechanisms in each of these domains that have been looked at. So each of these little areas here with the icon and the text represents one SOBC network study. And you can see there's quite a variety. There's some overlap. Tension control, emotion regulation shows up more than once. Orientation toward the future, delay discounting as an idea that that rewards are discounted in relation to time, and this might change how people make choices that affect behavior. There's a lot going on in this particular domain. Here's some more about stress reactivity. These projects measure things like not just stress reactivity in the moment to a stressor, but how long it takes people to recover from a stressor, pile up of a stressor, which has to do with recurrence of stressors that sort of pile up over the course of a given day. And then, as I mentioned, interpersonal and social processes, not as much work in this area, but there's some really interesting work looking at coercive conflict in different kinds of dyad pairs. So now as we move into this new phase of SOBC, it just began this January. This phase, the network is expanding and the structure of SOBC is also expanding as well, as you can see here. So Janine Simmons at National Institutes of Health is leading the overall effort. Russ Poldrack and Patrick Bissett at Stanford are leading the experiment factory branch of SOBC, which has to do with web-based computer tasks to measure potential mechanisms of change. Michael Otto, who you know well from Boston University, is leading the outreach and dissemination branch of SOBC, which is a really substantial part of our efforts now to reach a wider audience and to bring in more scientists into the SOBC fold. At Columbia, which is where I'm based at the medical center, my colleagues Donald Edmondson and Ian Cronish are heading up that branch of this initiative. And there's a couple things going on there. One of them is integration with behavior change initiatives. So there's other existing behavior change networks, some of them overseas. For example, Susan Mickey in London is obviously heading up a whole program there, which actually works very nicely with SOBC, and we're exploring the areas of overlap and the areas of difference and having projects related to initiatives such as that one. There's also web resources and tool development of various kinds. And then finally, there's the Busara Center, which is based in Kenya, led by Channing Jiang, and they are hosting the measures repository and leading efforts to create updates in the repository, which I'll be describing actually in a moment. So the real focus in this next phase is developing sustainable resources for the broader community. And I highlight sustainable and broader community because up until now, it's been, as I said, a small to medium-sized growing network, but it's been a relatively curated set of resources. And we're now opening it up to be contributed to by the broader community of scientific researchers who study behavior change efforts. And I just want to say that in particular, psychological scientists are uniquely suited not only to benefit from these resources, but to help contribute to them. And I'll just say that, my own training is as an affective scientist. I got my degree and PhD in experimental psychology. So my training is really on more of the basic side rather than the applied side. And so it really helps to have communication as you find yourself in a particular niche or a particular perspective, to work with people who have different perspectives to help build these resources together. Okay, so one of the resources I want to highlight is the measures repository. So just like the name suggests, it is in fact a repository of measures. And they're particularly measures assessed using the SOBC method. And the repository documents the progress of these measures as they step through those phases of the method, those 4 phases that I outlined a few minutes ago. It includes Open Science Framework Foundation to ensure that the science remains transparent. There are currently 186 measures in the repository. There are more measures to be added as projects are concluded and new projects are initiated. And I just want to mention, in addition to the new measures coming in, there's also development on the repository from the perspective of a particular measure. So each measure should, the repository is structured in such a way that they become richer over time as they progress through the stages and gather more information. And just to reiterate, this is a resource for the scientific community. So definitely we encourage you to go to that URL at the bottom there. It's not clickable from the slide, so you'll have to type it in. We apologize, but scienceofbehaviorchange.org/measures will take you directly there. And we also encourage you just to go to the website, the gray part, scienceofbehaviorchange.org, just to explore all the resources and information there. So the repository, none of it would be possible without the Open Instruments project based at Busara Center for Behavioral Economics, again, in Nairobi, Kenya. And they are making all kinds of updates, making it as intuitive and easy to use as possible. It continues to develop over time, and they're very interested in taking feedback and adapting based on that feedback to make it as tailored to what scientists actually need and can benefit from as possible. Okay, so Experiment Factory I mentioned has to do with computer-based tasks that measure key potential psychological mechanisms typically that might be investigated in behavior change research. There are all kinds of updates and renovations happening in this new phase in Experiment Factory over at Stanford, as well as further integration with the repository. But I'll show you where things stand at the moment with a little demo here. So when you go to the repository, it essentially looks like this. You'll see some introductory text. You can click read more, that little blue clickable link to get some more information about how the repository works. There's an email address there if you have questions about the repository. The measures are all listed there on the right in blue. There's a search bar to make it easily searchable. So if you know what you're looking for, if you're going in to find the Stroop test task, for example, you can just type Stroop and hit enter. If you don't know exactly what you're looking for, though, there's all kinds of search capacity. And one of the first things you might want to do under source is choose SOBC. So if you want to look specifically at measures that are being validated through that 4-stage process, you can click that link to see those. I believe there are over 100 of those. I think it's about 113, and that is also a growing number. But there's also other sources. So previously, repositories were sort of scattered across the web and not integrated in one place. And the effort here in the Open Instruments project is to really gather everything together. So there's GEM, which is the grid-enabled measures database, and then MIDAS, I have to always look up what it stands for, is the measurement instrument database for the social sciences, among others. So these are all the sources for each measure indicated in the repository. You can sort by type, self-report, task, observational, for example, by SOBC stage. There are some more further filtering by duration that it's expected to take a study participant to do the measure, target population, and then there's also hypothesized domains. I'm seeing some questions come in. We will look at the end. So keep typing your questions and we'll get to them at the end. So I'll just mention in the hypothesized domain, you can see there's a wide variety of potential sort features here. But one of the key things is that, there we go, the blue boxes show you those 3 domains of the potential mechanisms. But there's also, you might want to sort by study population, cancer, obesity, et cetera, or community-based participatory research, or some other domain that is of interest to you and a measure that you might be looking for. Okay, so just to show you a little bit more, it's a really rich resource here. So I give you an example on the screen of a task and a self-report scale. So the attention network test, if it's a task, you'll see a blue button that says access measure if you want to actually obtain the measure. In the case of a scale, it'll say download measure. So for the ANT, let's say we click on access measure, it will take you directly to Experiment Factory. So you'll be able to walk through the instructions and actually take the task as if you were a participant. So you have sort of direct access to the stimulus presentation through a browser. So you don't need stimulus presentation software. You don't need ePrime or anything like that to be able to access Experiment Factory, which is one of the great benefits of that. In the case of a scale, you'll get a modifiable download of a Word document that contains all the wordings of the items as well as the response options. Critically, you also get the scoring information for every scale. So it tells you the filler options, what's reverse scored, the subscale scoring procedures. It's really helpful to have all that in one place. So it's kind of one-stop shopping for looking for measures to make life easier for researchers. Couple other things, if you click more information, as you might expect, you get more information. It tells you a bit about the subscales in this case and a little bit about the measure and what it's designed to assess. You get the stage of the SOBC model. In this case, it's showing you the identified stage and just a little brief description of why it's believed that the BIS-BAS in this case might be related to change in behavior. There are text citations available indicating validation paper and relevant research that's cited in this section. And the Busara Center has amazingly made these exportable in a wide variety with reference managers. So you can, if you prefer EndNote or RefWorks, you can choose whichever is your favorite and use that. There's also OSF study details. And if you haven't yet downloaded the measure and decide to do so at this stage, there's an opportunity to do that. I'm just checking the questions just to make sure that nobody's saying that they can't hear me or something like that. Okay, it seems like it's okay. Moving on from here. There we go. Just a couple quick more things. So OSF documentation, if you click that link, you actually go directly to the OSF page. And for the group that submitted the measure in question. And I'll just sort of as a side note mention that this particular group submitted 62 measures of self-regulation, and they have a really impressive large-scale project looking at the ontology of self-regulation. And Dr. Otto, when he comes back to speak, I think that in the very last slide is about a capstone conference that is coming up. And so this is some of the data from this particular project, along with various other exciting findings and new directions, will be presented there. So that's just one of many things I'll just mention briefly. And then Google Scholar. This is just a fun feature that will actually take you to Google Scholar and run a search of the measure in question to do a search of relevant literature. I'll also just say the repository includes login information. You can go in as a researcher and save, if you create an account, and save measures of interest so that you don't have to remember them, or it'll store them for you to make it a nice resource to be able to return to. So there's a lot of new features coming out that Busara Center is introducing. Okay, and I want to take just a minute to talk about one other resource among several that are in this new phase, the development of guidelines for conducting and reporting rigorous and transparent behavior change science. And many of you are probably familiar with the PRISMA checklist, maybe most of you, the preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analysis. So the idea here is this very simple, ultimately, checklist has really vastly improved the overall quality of systematic reviews since 2009. It's increasingly adopted. It ensures that people, for example, have an appropriate number of databases that they search and an appropriate search strategy. And so akin to the PRISMA guidelines, we are developing a protocol for reporting the experimental medicine approach, which we're calling PREMA. And Michael Otto discovered just this week that in Sanskrit, and we may not be pronouncing it right, but prema seems to mean love and affection in Sanskrit, which is a nice little bonus that we didn't realize. So this is a brief organized guide for behavioral researchers about not only how to conduct, but again, how to report valid behavior change science. And just briefly, we have a series of planned development steps for this moving forward with this next phase. First, forming an executive committee of behavior change experts, reviewing the relevant literature in a variety of domains, physical activity, sleep, medication adherence, all the relevant behaviors, surveying both behavioral scientists and journal editors, and then using these survey analyses together with the executive committee to achieve consensus to determine the final checklist items, and then ultimately disseminating the checklist along with its rationale. And I'll just end my portion of the presentation here by saying that this resource as well may be particularly valuable to psychological scientists, to you all in particular, especially those of you who are relatively new, like I have been until recently, to the conduct and reporting of interventions designed to change human behavior. So if you find yourself on one side or the other, having this guide can really step you through and provide the scaffolding that you need to do the science and to report on the science. Okay, so with that, I'm going to report back to Dr. Michael Otto here.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And let me stand that last point for just a moment about giving away the experimental medicine approach to the newest investigators in the field or our students. Jeff and I will be working also to make a slide deck like this available for teaching. So I think this is such a nice way in research methods course to try to introduce, maybe taking them to the SOBC pages, helping them know really exactly what a measure does look like, how it's linked to the literature. Hopefully you can imagine that all the buttons that Jeff went through for teaching can be very valuable in a more lab-based course or even in a survey course. So keep an eye out. We'll be distributing a slide deck here in the future. But this is part of the theme of, so why does it matter, right? Jeff was talking about how aspects of the SOBC is designed to make mechanistic questions easier to do. Let me take just a moment here at the end to talk about the why. Why should SOBC matter to you? How might it matter to you? And my first answer is, oh my gosh, I love why questions. My career is all about, and some of your careers are all about that why question. Why does this treatment work? Which is, for me, a richer question. Let me go to the next part of the slide. Because I think it guides clinicians and psychological science at a nice level, at the level of principles of treatment instead of protocols. And I promised you at the beginning I'd come back to criticizing treatment manuals or just reminding you, all of you listening, of the classic criticisms of treatment manuals. Oh my gosh, this protocol of things to do is too restrictive. It doesn't allow me to do my innovations, doesn't allow me to branch out, etc. That's because we very naturally write these things at the level of the protocol that was used in the research trial. With my manuals, with others, there's been this push to try to also include or mainly include the principle. Here's the target, and here's all sorts of ways into engaging the target. And if you write a manual that way, it, by its nature, brings with it the sense of both, here's some things that work, but here's the kind of thing that works that lends itself to innovation. So let's look at the next part of this slide. So I think that makes it especially useful for enhancing treatment efficacy, because you don't want to be in a position of saying, I got to make this better. I missed too many of my patients did not respond. How do I make it better? And the protocol-based thinking is like, more cowbells. We need to put in more of something from the protocol. Well, we're not going to do more cowbells, but the term more cowbells is very similar to saying, what element of the music do we do more of? More cognitive instruction? Will that make a difference? If you have the mechanistic target, if you're used to measuring the mechanistic target, not just in your science, but also attending to it in your clinical practice, it at least guides you to, we got to do something to change that thing. That's where we're failing. We have not engaged the mechanistic target. Or also for different types of innovations, combining treatments. It's a way of saying, all right, does this treatment with a different protocol aim at a same or different mechanism? Does that help me think about novel ways of combining treatment to get more oomph out of it, or combining elements of treatment to try to better get the treatment response we want for our patients? Next slide. And of course, there's another answer, because it's important for your funding. So another URL, by the way, we're going to do the best we can. I showed a URL earlier. Jeff showed a URL. I'm showing another one. At the end of this, we're going to make the URLs available to you. But for funding, this is a list of just some of the institutes and some of the announcements, announcements offering funding that use this approach, a experimental medicine approach. So I'm just showing you that here's one part of the list, here's the next slide and more of the list, and next slide, this is what sort of is in the list. So I picked an NIMH one, and there it is. In an effort to glean more information about the mechanisms underlying disorders and potential mechanisms of intervention effects, here's the important part, NIMH is requiring an experimental therapeutics approach, etc., etc. So it also matters for money, it matters for supporting your research, and SOBC is here to try to make that requirement easier to meet. Let's go to the next slide. Just more of the same sort of information, again, drawn sort of randomly from a PA. Target engagement refers to the verification that the intervention has had the predicted effect on the target mechanism. And Jeff talked about this, that we all think we do this, but we don't necessarily show it in the research report to give the effect size, so we really know it's that thing, it's the why that we've affected, and affecting that target makes my patients better. So let's keep developing ways of engaging that target and engaging other targets. That is a very cool way for science to progress And that's what we're talking about here today. All right, so I do want to say, I realize that 555 of you already voted with your feet to have interest in this topic, to sign up for this presentation. Jeff and I are absolutely delighted by that. And this just adds motivation on to the motivation you already had coming here. Let's go to the last slide. And to sort of see the work of SOBC, the work that has been before us, before this effort at, you saw the 3 domains, but Jeff and my effort at dissemination, we'd love for you to attend the SOBC Capstone Conference. Now, unlike those URLs that we gave you that you better type fast, we'll give them to you later, you could take your cell phone right now, aim it right there at the Scan Me, and get your link directly into signing up for this event, February 22nd and 23rd. If you want to know more about it, the URL gives you information. The Scan Me gets you right there to sign up. All right, that said, we'll leave this up just for a bit if you're getting your camera out, but we're going to bring Jeff on and we're going to get to your questions at this point. And I believe Andy's going to help us. Is that true?
I am. And Michael and Jeff, let me just say thank you so much for such a fantastic presentation. And we have a good set of questions that's coming in, and we invite more, and we'll try to get to as many as we can, of course. Perhaps starting with a couple of questions directed perhaps at Jeff surrounding some of the tools that you demonstrated. Some interesting questions from a number of participants, actually. One surrounds the different languages that materials might be available in. Are the materials mostly available in English currently? Are they in other languages, such as Spanish? And if not, are there ways for APS members or others to contribute to the development of these tools in other languages?
Absolutely. So for the most part, for sure, measures so far are almost entirely in English, if not entirely. I think there may be some others. It's definitely something we've talked about, and you know, our center, where I do my own research, you know, half of our participants speak Spanish, and so we administer those things in that way. So, yeah, so it's a direction that we're conscious of. There's no reason that it needs to be only English, except that this, you know, it started out that way as an NIH effort in English for the most part so far. But yes.
Thank you. Sort of a related question, again, around some of these materials is, are some of the materials that you shared, are they open and accessible? Are they, do you need a particular subscription to access some? Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, in terms of the measures repository, it is certainly open. So I mentioned the account sign-in. That's totally free and is also not necessary. That's just a sort of added feature. But if you go to the measures repository, everything can be downloaded freely. Every once in a while, you will stumble on a questionnaire in the literature that has restrictions on it and can't be used, and that would be an exception. But everything up there is free.
That's great, thank you. We have a question from an attendee who is a professor at a small liberal arts university. And that person is curious if you have any suggestions on how students might utilize the repository or some of the ideas that you've spoken about today for course assignments or research projects.
Well, I'll say just quickly, we do hope to get a slide set available. We'll be advertising that through places like APS, for example, to let those instructing know that a set like this, if you want to use something like this in your class, and then of course, using lab time or assignment time to go and step through the SOBC website to actually feel what it's like to do a task, I think is a great learning enterprise. So Jeff, what would you add? I think it's naturally set up for that application.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Yeah, and it might be a nice idea if you're teaching experimental methods that maybe students can choose one of those 3 buckets and then choose 1 or 2 measures within a bucket and go find it on the repository and maybe use that for study planning. So I don't know, just a thought. But yes, I think that's a great idea for an educational use of the repository.
Right, and that linked onto into a search function so they can see relevant articles, boy, we can make students get their term papers done more easily with that, right? So they really can do the whole thing of getting to the measure and then getting the research on it and being able to write up a report if that's what your class is setting out to do.
And in fact, speaking of students, we have a question from an individual who's getting started with their research career and is applying to PhD programs. Do you have recommendations for people who are at that career stage and are excited to enter this area of study?
Yeah, I'll just say quickly that one of the great things that we're trying to do, I'm not saying we're doing great things, but one of the big ventures that SOBC is trying to engage in is getting young scientists who are in early career stage scientists to really adopt this, sorry, doorbell ringing, to adopt this method and to contribute to these resources. So I guess my recommendation would be to jump in and if you have questions to write the SOBC email address and we can go from there.
And I want to add that being able to talk mechanism, it just plays so well. My job has been, I guess, a gatekeeper, accepting either interns when I was at MGH or accepting graduate students, and someone who can talk about not just the elements of a protocol for treatment, but the mechanisms that are being targeted is always an impressive student. So yeah, I want to encourage a close embrace of mechanism at every stage of your career.
The last question I'll ask, just to be sensitive of both of your times and our attendees' times, is we have a question from an individual who's looking to do more of this work, but is potentially seeking collaborators to work with in this space. Do you have any recommendations on steps APS member might take to find collaborators in this area of research?
I saw that question. It's a great question. I don't think we have a ready-made list, but I like the idea of a resource to do that. I don't know, Michael, if you have thoughts about steps to reach out for.
Well, I do like the way that the registry leads you back to who sort of published the measure, who got it on the SOBC list. That those investigators care about it, have been engaged in it, and so those are perfect investigators for the cold call, just to see if people want to, to have a second site for a pilot is so tempting at so many stages of research that I encourage the sort of cold call, because you may catch even an advanced researcher who's at a point when doing this in two locations or having an echo of a protocol somewhere else is really tempting. Aside from that, the link to citations on a measure is also a great idea to see who's done what, and again, might give you the targets for people to reach out to.
So thank you very much. Michael and Jeff, this was just, again, a fantastic presentation, and we're so grateful to you for your participation and presentation. Sort of as a last minute plug, I want to remind our attendees here of the 2021 APS virtual convention that's occurring May 26 and 27, 2021. If you want to submit some of your science, perhaps related to the science of behavior change, our submissions for that do close at the end of this month. So think about that now. But in the meantime, like I mentioned earlier, we're eager to circulate the slides and recordings that you heard today with the attendees of the webinar. And we thank you so much for your attendance, and Michael and Jeff for your presentations. I hope everybody has a great day.
Thank you, Andy. Thanks for everybody who attended.
All right, thank you to all. Bye-bye.